So we've spoken about the basics of the first wave of Islamic conquest or expansion, how the Arab nomads under the new Muslim/believer community managed to find a political vacuum that allowed them to expand very quickly into Syria/Palestine and Iraq in that area, and then eventually quickly soon after into Egypt. But there's a larger set of questions here, which is beyond the sort of this narrative of conquest. What did it actually look like on the ground for people in Syria, in Iraq, and in Persia? And more importantly, was this conquest violent? And if so, how was it violent? What type of violence was there? And thirdly, what is the role of religion in this conquest? Is this actually a conquest just to redirect the energies of these tribes, to allow them to raid and attack people rather than have them fight among Muslims? Or is that motivated by some sort of pietistic, transformative change on their part? And fourthly, what evidence do we have for any of this? What evidence do we actually have for the effects of the conquest? Now, let's go into that by looking at probably the written sources we have, other than the records of these conquests in the biographies of the Prophet Muhammad, which again were written about 150 to 200 years after the fact. But we do have some Christian sources, that is sources mostly in Syriac and Greek, a bit in Coptic, Armenian, and Georgian, depicting the early Islamic conquests, about the arrival of a new group, right? So we have this guy, Thomas the Presbyter, writing, I believe, in Syriac. He writes 945, that is 634. So we're talking about 2 years after the death of the Prophet Muhammad. On Friday, 4th of February, at the 9th hour, there's a battle between the Romans, that's the Byzantines, and the nomads of Muhammad, Tayyaya the Muhammad, in Palestine, 12 miles east of Gaza. The Romans fled, leaving behind the patriarch Brirdin, whom the Tayyaya killed. Some 4,000 poor villagers of Palestine were killed there, Christian, Jews, and Samaritans. The Tayyaya ravaged the whole region. Right, so we have often these Christian sources talking about mass attacks and death, and this was, I think, often fell into ideas about the nature of the conquest as an extremely violent and transformative effect. Similarly, Coptic homily, so something that was said during the sermon, in 640 speaks of the Saracens who are oppressors, who give themselves up to prostitution, massacre, and lead into captivity the sons of men, saying, "We both fast and pray." So it's interesting here we have both kind of the violence of conquest, the violence of attacks, right? We mentioned massacres, captivity, so they're taking captives, they're massacring people, but also a deep pietistic aspect, fasting and praying. In the first one, by the way that they identify these people is, again, nomads of Muhammad, right? So at this point, they don't really have a name at this point. So that's some of the Christian written sources, but what archaeological sources do we have? Because sometimes archaeology, when we look at what's actually on the ground, gives us a better and more accurate depiction of what is going on. And this, when we look at the archaeology, we actually find a very different picture than what the written remnants of the written sources, because we really just have a few mentions here and there in Syriac and Greek and Coptic. We just have pieces of those. But if we look at the archaeology, we find a different picture. The most interesting thing is that essentially there is, at least in the cities, I'm not talking about the countryside, because again, most of the people lived in the countryside, but in the cities, we don't have an archaeological layer of destruction. So if you imagine what would happen in a conquest scenario, you imagine, again, people attacking cities, burning them down, looting them, etc., and you would often in case that places are violently taken over. In the archaeological record, you can find a sort of burn layer, right? A layer indicating a fire, some sort of destruction. But we don't have that, at least for the cities in Palestine. And in fact, we find that after the initial conquest, most of the places were not destroyed. They were just required to pay payment of taxes or tribute. And that is another point here, is that these followers of Muhammad are not trying to convert the local population. In fact, most of the population at this time is Christian or Jewish, and what we have is the mass moment of conversion doesn't come in the conquests. It comes actually hundreds of years later, around the year 1000. So we're now in the year 600. We're talking about the year 600. The moment of conversion mostly occurring between 1000 to 1200. Now, of course, there are people who convert very early on, but for the majority of the population, that doesn't occur for actually hundreds of years later. And this makes sense because what they wanted from these people initially is just peaceful, non-rebellious subjects who paid taxes, who paid tribute, and then they were left to lead their own lives. Only a few cities that basically had a very difficult, refused to surrender, had a difficult and destructive siege, which we can find some evidence for, but we do have probably at the same time local raiding, so places that did not have city walls, that could not withstand attacks, were probably much more susceptible to raiding, again by the same nomadic populations that were now part of the new so-called Muslim armies. Interestingly, we continue to see churches and other material in Palestine being built for a long time after the conquest, right? So at least until 150 years afterwards, we have many examples of churches continuously being built, expanded, etc. The most interesting thing, though, is that in certain churches, we actually find them being used as churches while including Muslim places of worship. Right, so if we go to the Kathisma Church today between Jerusalem and Bethlehem, the ruins of which you can see here, what you find is that there is a niche, a sort of prayer niche made in the direction of Jerusalem for Muslims that they could use, which suggests, again, the more evidence towards the sort of believer hypothesis of the early Muslim community, that these people were actually saw themselves as part of a larger monotheistic movement of which Jews and Christians could be part of, while in this initial point, in the first 50 to 100 years, we still have plenty of evidence, archaeological and textual, that shows that Muslims encountered and used churches as spaces of worship. We can see a similar thing here, right, in Subaita, or Shvita in Hebrew. Here we have a church with a mihrab, that is a prayer niche built into it, so something to accommodate again Muslims or the kind of believers who were willing to use spaces, Christian spaces, Jewish spaces, as spaces of worship when necessary. And this makes sense, of course, because they're not right after the initial conquest or the first few decades. It doesn't make sense to necessarily build your own places. At the same time, they're not taking over churches and transforming them into mosques right away. What they're doing is essentially using churches as spaces of worship because they see them as allied spaces. Of course, we have also different examples. Caesarea, supposedly, according to narratives, was destroyed by the Islamic campaigns. But we also know that it had been heavily destroyed by the Sasanians in their war with the Byzantines just a few years beforehand, right? So 10 years beforehand, the city had already been basically ravaged by the Iranian armies of the Sasanians. So it's hard to tell in this case which conquest ended up destroying it more fully. One of the more interesting things, keep this in mind, in Caesarea there was a church, a very large church with an octagonal plan. Now keep this in mind because this is going to come up again when we speak about the Dome of the Rock, because here we have actually an image of a very common type of church, which we'll see is the model, one of the models for the Dome of the Rock as an architectural form. So they were encountering, as they moved into Palestine and Syria, they were encountering churches sometimes that looked like this. When we speak also about continuities, we also have to think about how are they administering these places, because not only were they conquering, now they had to collect taxes, they had to deal with the process of administration. And for the most part, they basically just left the administration that existed in place. So that meant keeping the same bureaucrats. They continued to use the same language of administration. So in Syria and Palestine, Egypt, they continued to use Greek. In Iraq and Persia, they used Persian. And even they continued to use essentially the same coins. Now, this is important because technically, I don't know if this had started at that moment, but the kind of two signs of sovereignty in an Islamic context is that your name is on the coin, and that a ruler's name is on the coin, and that a ruler's name is recited at the Friday prayer. But here initially we don't have that at all, and in fact these on the top are basically Sasanian coins, on the bottom are Greek coins. But what we have here, interestingly, that these are kind of the first coins of the early Islamic kingdoms, and they're basically Sasanian coins. But if you see here, there is a bit of Arabic. I think it says something Allah, I have to look it up again, but something in the name of God type thing. But all you have is a bit of Arabic added to a Sasanian coin, and the Sasanian coin features a Sasanian Shah or king on it, and a fire temple and Zoroastrian priests. So we're going to get back to these coins and look at how they changed over time. So keep these in mind. Similarly, here we have Byzantine coins with a Byzantine emperor, who is again also a religious figure. And we have a version of a bit of Arabic just added at the bottom. But for the most part, these coins stay the same. So again, continuity is the rule here. What we have in terms of evidence of the conquest is pretty minimal, and as a destructive force, we do have, of course, there certainly were people being attacked and enslaved. But I think this also wasn't a major transformative break in terms of rulership or in terms of culture, as we'll see. As I pointed out, most people did not convert. The administrative languages stayed the same, and at least for the first 50 to 100 years, basically things are run as they were before.